Welcome to your Principles of Psychology Development Across the Lifespan lesson. Here's our agenda for our online this week. We're going to talk about nature versus nurture, and then the integration of nature and nurture, in other words known as the whole human, and social development and attachment. So I want you to just take a moment and note the learning outcomes below, and remember that by the end of this online lesson, you want to be able to answer those questions or define those in detail, because that's what you'll be tested on in this course. I'll also mention that I will ask you on a few occasions to pause or stop the video and then come back to play it, because there's going to be some online activities that I'd like you to engage in independently. Starting now. So this is what's called a bookends activity. So once I'm finished describing this, I'd like you to pause the video and take time to fill this out. Trust me, it'll help you with solidifying your learning. So just pause for a moment and for yourself, jot down your understanding of nature, of nurture, of parenting, and of attachment and subjective well-being. Anything that comes to mind, anything you've learned in the past, anything that sounds like it might fit with that, whether it's key terms or just, something you heard or remember reading about, jot it down. And if there's any questions that you have, include that in this chart. So again, pause the video and come back when you're ready. Starting off with nature. Yes, Lady Gaga. Why? Because she's the one who came up with the song, Baby, I Was Born This Way. So remember her when we're talking about nature. What were you born with? What way were you born? What does she mean by that? So the key terms that'll be important for you to know are DNA, chromosomes, genes, temperament, and genetic disorders. So how do we define those? DNA is defined as something that contains a record of instructions needed to make a human. Pretty important. And in fact, a fun fact from your textbook is that genes that define who you are, so those instructions that make you uniquely human, you as the person that you are, actually only account for 2% of all of our DNA. And the rest is actually uncoded, and scientists are still trying to discover what it all means. So DNA contains the record of instructions that are needed to make a human. You wouldn't exist without it. Chromosomes exist within the DNA. Okay, so they exist within the DNA, and they are the coded instructions for heredity that keep the genes intact. You might have heard that there are 46 chromosomes that are arranged in 23 pairs that come from our mother and from our father. And then genes themselves, they are small segments of DNA that can be known as dominant or recessive. And they actually predict the characteristics that we have that make us uniquely human, such as eye color, height, and so forth. Again, it's important to note, and this is listed in your textbook as well, that there are some single genes that are responsible for inherited features like eye color, but actually most of our genes have what are called polygenic characteristics. So they're controlled by many genes working in combination. In other words, there's no single gene for height to make somebody tall or short, but rather multiple genes work in combination to make somebody tall or short. It's called polygenic characteristics, which is noted there. Okay, so again, that's our nature, what we're born with, 3 key terms. You'll also see there's a couple of video links that I will share with you on DC Connect that you can watch on your own time. So the 2 other key terms are temperament and genetic disorders. Temperament are inherited physical core of personality, and yes, this can be debatable, but you will see some personality theorists believe that personality traits are global and stable and resistant to change. Not to say that they can't change, but they're resistant to, and that's because we're born in the core of our personality. Again, inherited traits from our parents, biological parents. And then, of course, there are things known as genetic disorders, which are inherited from parents through genes. They can be cystic fibrosis, intellectual disability, Huntington's disease, and so forth. Now, as social service workers, we're going to look at the genetic disorders and pay attention to the impact that somebody born with that, the impact that it would have on their life and their development going forward. And while we won't get into this debate together, it might be fun for you to just take a moment and Google Darwin or Google survival of the fittest, and just food for thought about that theory and how it applies today, the notion of survival of the fittest. Does it still exist? Do you disagree with it entirely? And why? Okay, so we've talked about nature, we've talked about what we're born with. Now we're going to talk about the environmental influences, which are known as nurture. And it is defined as the sum of all external, so think about that external, that which is around us, external conditions that affect a person. Your textbook will say, and this is important to recognize, this is sort of new leading edge research, and that is that external influences can still affect the development of a human in infancy and adulthood, even if those influences are happening before birth. So prenatal impact. So while the fetus is developing within the woman, there can still be impact that happens that lead to environmental outcomes. So examples would be stress, nutrition, and substance use that can lead to things like congenital problems. So things that a child is born with that are not genetic. They can lead to birth defects like fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Again, the child isn't born with that, but rather develops it as a result of what the mother exposes herself to, which would be alcohol, and so forth. So a woman can actually be unknowingly exposed to what are called teratogens, which are harmful substances while pregnant. And again, that can be alcohol. Maybe the woman didn't know she was pregnant and continued on drinking. It can also be things like pesticides, lead, and other. And can again have an impact which is environmental because it's external to the woman, but it has an impact on the development of the child. There are also sensitive periods in development, and actually Montessori schools were developed based on knowledge of these sensitive periods from 0 to 3 years old. And so again, I've included a video link here for you to learn a little bit more about sensitive periods on your own time. So ultimately we come to the debate, and that is nature versus nurture. Or is it nature and nurture? I prefer the latter. So we really want to combine our understanding, our knowledge of nature, so the DNA, the chromosomes, the genes, the temperament, so what your clients are born with, how they come out of the womb, what they are born with, inherited from their biological parents, and then nurture, what was the environmental impact? So were there any teratogens that they were exposed to? Do they have things like fetal alcohol spectrum disorder? What was their life like during those sensitive periods? Did they deal with trauma and attachment issues, which we'll talk about momentarily? Were they in an environment where they were largely deprived? Was it an enriched environment? And how did that interplay of those environmental characteristics tie in with what they were born with? And always remember that genes can be switched on and off through life. So again, that combines the integrity of nature and nurture, that we are born with genes, but they can actually be switched on and off based on external things that happen and exposures and relationships and all sorts of environmental influences. Cool stuff. So we can't get through a lecture on development without talking about emotional and social development. So here we'll go from hardwired emotions such as happiness and fear to social emotions like jealousy and embarrassment. And all the while, I want you to remember cultural similarities in hardwired emotions across cultures. Researchers have found that facial expressions of happiness, fear, sadness, they actually are consistent across cultures. However, there are social emotions like jealousy and embarrassment that differ based on cultural experience. So I've included a video link here again. This is Harlow and his monkeys. I really encourage you watch the video. It's like less than 10 minutes and it is so incredible. This historical, very impactful study in psychology where he took different monkeys and he put them in cages with like mother monkeys that are made out of wire and one out of a soft blanket. And it's just incredible to watch the monkeys' attachment to each of those pseudo mothers and the separation and the anxiety that ensues based on that. So it leads us into talking about social development. Here we go. We're going to pause the video here and you're going to actually do this checklist for yourself, to yourself, that nobody else has to know or see. What I want you to do is just go through the checklist of either secure, avoidant, or ambivalent, and you decide what fits best with you. What is your attachment style? And when you're ready, unpause the video and we'll continue on. So attachment quality, based on that checklist, this will get you thinking. Somebody who is securely attached, and you might notice this in young children if you've ever been around and observed any, a securely attached child is stable, has a positive emotional bond with their caregiver, gets upset when the caregiver is absent, and seeks to be near the caregiver upon return. An insecure or avoidant attachment leads to anxious emotional bond. They turn away from their caregiver upon return. So it's insecure, and avoidant. Insecure ambivalent, so think about the definition of ambivalent, is someone who's anxious emotional bond has mixed feelings. So they're ambivalent, they have mixed feelings. They kind of seek to be both near the returning caregiver, but they also angrily resist contact. And in North America, 2/3 of all children from middle-class families are actually securely attached. So that's kind of reassuring. 2/3 are securely attached. And think about the relevance that this would have from such a young age on us as social service workers who might be working with children, but we might also be working with adults who were once children. So always remember that. This adult was once a child. What was their attachment like? What were their early exposures? Of course, that segues naturally into parenting, which is a journey that lasts a lifetime, can be deeply rooted, deeply impactful, both through genes, of course, we've talked about the nature, and also the environmental upbringing based on caregiver response. So it's important to recognize there are 3 known parenting styles, and they are authoritarian at one end, permissive at the other extreme, and the one we strive for and hope to see is in the middle there, and that's authoritative. So the description of an authoritarian parent is someone who's got rigid rules, obedience, and authority. On the opposite end of the spectrum, when we're looking at permissive, a permissive parent is someone who has little guidance, allows too much freedom, and doesn't hold their children accountable for actions. And of course, you can start reading about the outcomes based on this chart. In the middle, we strive for this, authoritative, who have firm and consistent guidance. Just to flesh that out a little further, again, the 3 common styles are described as authoritarian, who demand obedience, they have power assertion, do it because I said so, they withdraw their love. Permissive on the opposite spectrum are warm and affectionate, but they have no rules, do whatever you want, quite the opposite. And then authoritative is the firm and consistent guidance, the love, the affection, the management techniques. Don't worry about the numbering here, worry about the definitions. So again, what are the outcomes of that? An authoritarian parent produces a child who becomes emotionally stiff, withdrawn, apprehensive, lacks curiosity, and is dependent on adults for approval. I'm going to go back for just a moment. You can kind of see the natural connection between the authoritarian parenting style and the authoritarian outcome of the child. And again, the permissive parent produces a child who's dependent on adults, a little bit immature, might misbehave frequently, and has a sense of entitlement. Again, connect the dots, see what the parenting style is like, what the outcome becomes. And then lastly, authoritative, which we strive for, we produce competent children who are self-controlled, independent, assertive, and inquiring. That would be awesome. That's what we ideally want. Sorry, now that we've talked about parental influences and outcomes, I'm going to spend just a little bit of time and I'm going to conclude with this note on attachment and trauma. Because trauma can occur either sort of knowingly within our control or outside of our control. But regardless of how it occurs, whether it's like a natural disaster type trauma or whether it's a parent abusing their child type trauma, the impact can be the same or have similar qualities, although there is a difference between chronic and acute. So trauma is defined as an event that's outside of normal experience. And what happens when an event outside of normal experience occurs? There is research that says that neurodevelopment of the brain, so actual brain structures, can be adversely affected by trauma and therefore develops differently as compared to emotionally healthy children. Remember the brain's response to a perceived or a real threat? It's all about survival. So innately, our brains respond with fight, such as rage or lash out, flight, which is to run away or withdraw, and then freeze, which is to dissociate. And if you look back at the parenting styles, you can see how this might relate. So remember, when you're working with a client, they might still be in fight, flight, or freeze response, even as adults, because that's how they've learned to respond to the environmental circumstances. Children who are traumatized will not just get over it on their own. No, in fact, us as social service workers, this last note that I have for you here is the good news. Neuroscience tells us that the brain can change all through life, but it needs help to make those changes happen. And you as a social service worker can be that help. So ultimately, our subjective well-being is based on emotions, personal factors, and goals, and we're here to help our clients achieve exactly that. So here's your end activity. Pause the video and come back when you're ready.